Hi everybody. So I'm just going to give you a short overview of virtual focus group discussions. So this has been recorded in 2020 where in many ways the research world has been turned upside down, at least in terms of qualitative research, because now with restrictions in place across almost every country across the globe around physical distancing, the concept of being able to do a face-to-face focus group discussion has become much more imperiled and is much more practically difficult. So we thought it would be a good opportunity, given that is the scenario, to reflect on the possibility of virtual focus groups if we can't all be in the same place. And also to reflect on the fact that although there has been this interruption in fieldwork in many parts of the world, and we've had to shift to remote data collection, it's unlikely that whatever the future holds, this is entirely going to go away. It is unlikely that we'll revert to only doing face-to-face methods going forward. So remote data collection and virtual focus group discussions are likely to be part of the qualitative researchers' toolbox from now on. And it's going to be taken more seriously as an option, I would argue. So one of the things we need to think about if we're trying to kind of either shift our plans from face-to-face focus group discussions to being able to be done virtually, or even planning from the beginning to do virtual focus group discussions, which might be done either by video links. So for example, where everybody gets a Zoom connection or something similar, or done by phone without a video. You need to be thinking about, is this feasible in the setting? Is it appropriate for my research question? And is it a sensible idea? So just because we can, should we? And that's something that you'd need to be thinking about in making a decision about whether you can conduct virtual focus group discussions. It will be locally specific and it will depend on a number of factors. And I want to give you some kind of reflections and guidance on how you might approach this. So I'm going to draw on a case study that is very live right now. So I am leading a project for the WHO on the values and preferences of adolescents living with HIV to inform their global HIV treatment guidelines. And so what this means is that we've been conducting an online questionnaire globally, but we've also been trying to set up a number of focus group discussions with young people living with HIV to garner their views on psychosocial support needs and services. And because of our current circumstances in relation to kind of COVID restrictions around physical distancing, many of these focus groups have had to be done virtually. Now, nearly all of these focus group discussions are taking place in resource-stretched settings where we're not talking about adolescents having access to a laptop. We're talking about them being done on the phone, often in physically cramped conditions and often with poor connectivity. So I want to emphasize that any virtual focus group cannot just be considered to be a kind of transposing a face-to-face approach and just putting it into virtual. It requires more significant adaptation than just tweaks. And so I wanted to kind of reflect on what we have learned through the process of trying to conduct about 10 virtual focus group discussions around the world in challenging circumstances. So the first thing to think about is that we are working, as I mentioned, with adolescents, and that means a category of age between 10 and 24 as it's defined by the WHO for our study. And we need to think quite seriously about whether we're going to be able to adequately represent younger adolescents who are very unlikely to have their own access to phones and necessarily be comfortable or able to engage in these focus group discussions. So we've had to adjust our sample so that most of the virtual focus group discussions are taking place with older adolescents, 16, 17 years old and above. In some of the settings that we're doing our study, we can still do face-to-face focus groups. So what we've done in those settings is we've deliberately targeted younger adolescents because they would otherwise be silenced and inadequately represented through our alternative method of virtual focus group discussions. So there are two ways of thinking about it. In many ways, virtual focus group discussions, as with all virtual data collection, if people have the adequate equipment and access to engaging, it can mean that you broaden your representation because people don't have to physically turn up, but that they can dial in. And so that means that to some extent, we're able to access harder to engage groups than ordinarily. But then the adverse effects of that also means that we would exclude people that ordinarily would be more capable and able to present for face-to-face sessions. So for us here, we are missing the younger adolescents because of their uneven access to cell phones to take part in the virtual focus group discussions. The second thing that we have learned is that with any focus group, of course, you need to be very attentive to group dynamics. But particularly when we're using virtual focus group discussions, where at this stage, reliance on having a group discussion via a video platform or by phone is still quite unusual in a formal way for young people in many of the settings we're working in. So what we've opted to do is, given that is unfamiliar, we have composed groups for people to participate in the focus group discussions with people they already know. So that's what we would call a naturally occurring group. So because they're unfamiliar with the method, we have ensured that they are least familiar with other participants, because we felt that it would just become too weird and too difficult for them if they didn't know who they were speaking to. Practically, facilitating focus group discussions is always more difficult than it looks. This becomes more difficult again if you're trying to do it virtually. And as I'll go on to discuss, the way that we've done it is that we haven't been able to use video because of poor connectivity. This makes it really difficult for people to understand and to be able to read the kind of social dynamics of the discussion and when to interject, when to interrupt. And so it makes it much easier to be silent than it does necessarily to be proactive in pushing your opinion forward, which makes it much harder for the facilitator to know who's being silent because they don't necessarily have anything that they want to say right then, and who is being silenced by the dynamic and the forum created by the method. So what we have done is that ordinarily a kind of fairly standard number for a focus group discussion would be around 8. And of course, there's a range that you might use for that. But what we've done with our virtual focus group discussions is we've put a maximum of 5 in order to enable people to have a better opportunity to speak, to make it easier for the facilitator to kind of navigate the group dynamic and make it less crowded as people kind of pile in to talk over each other if they can't see each other and it's an unfamiliar method. So we've reduced our kind of maximum number of how many people would participate in the group. Ordinarily, people would take different approaches to when they would try and get consent for a focus group discussion. Now, best practice would suggest that this consent would take place before the data collection kind of event. But oftentimes, although that might have been discussed over the phone, the formal signing of the consent procedure and a revisiting of what the purpose of the focus group discussion is and how that sits within a broader research study would often be revisited at the start of a focus group discussion as people are coming in. It makes a lot of sense. But what we found with virtual focus group discussions is that the time is bound much more tightly than it would be if people are kind of coming for a physical event where you may have refreshments and snacks and a kind of informality to the beginning and the end, whereas it's much more kind of bracketed if you are online. So we have deliberately separated out the consenting process so that it happens before, the day before the focus group discussion. I think this is both more ethical and more logistically feasible, but it also means that you don't absorb a lot of your time of the kind of compartmentalized focus group discussion time going through the bureaucracy of the study, and you can get straight into the discussion. And secondly, it means that the focus group discussion can start with a lot more energy and dialogue from your participants rather than the slightly flatter bureaucratic details that come with often revisiting the consent process. We have had to revise our topic guides between our face-to-face and our virtual, they look quite different. You can do quite different things. So something that you would often do in a focus group discussion in terms of accessing and discussing social norms would be quite common to use, for example, ranking exercises, where you get people to kind of move a list around and prioritize how they would put in a hierarchy, certain services or certain concerns or problems. Unless you've got access to polling, etc., within a video platform, that becomes very difficult. And so we've had to be much less ambitious with the kinds of activities that we use for phone-based non-video virtual focus group discussions. We've had to put a lot of effort into our contingency planning. As I mentioned, connectivity is problematic. So we always have to have a plan for what happens if you lose someone or you all get cut off. We've had to reflect on how much do we gain from having a video, given that puts an extra burden on the connectivity. And so what we have done, because actually it kind of overloads the bandwidth available, is that we have used the video at the beginning for everybody to say hi to each other. And then we've asked everybody to turn the videos off, so that we have a greater security to our connection. But also, even if that isn't the case, sometimes it's worth thinking about what do we gain from the video. If the lighting isn't quite right, people can look quite shadowy, it can be quite distracting and diverting. Another thing that we have learned, and I hope you would anticipate, is that a virtual focus group discussion, you're not in control of the spaces that those participants are in. And that means that you can't guarantee their confidentiality, that they're not themselves being overheard, as you would if you were in four walls in a space, in a face-to-face focus group discussion. So we've had to kind of introduce ideas around safe words that a participant can give to tell the rest of the group that they've been interrupted or they're being overheard, or that they can no longer kind of participate in the same way. So you don't have control over the dynamic that might be affecting the participants to the same degree as one might hope to have when you're physically in the same space. And finally, we've always would emphasize the significance and the integrity involved in making sure that you have a feedback plan in place to tell your participants just what you're going to go on to do with the data that you've collected and how you're going to represent your findings back to them. And we found with virtual focus group discussions, this idea of literally talking into the ether makes that even more important. And so we've placed a lot of emphasis on the process after the virtual focus group discussion has finished. And for example, what we're going to be doing with this WHO study is we'll be making a short animated film, maybe 5 minutes, explaining who spoke to us in terms of what countries were represented, and then what they told us, so what our core findings were from the study, how we presented that to WHO, how WHO reacted and incorporated it into their global treatment guidelines, and therefore how it influenced the process. And use that as an example of showing that by participating in these virtual focus group discussions, they have had an opportunity to have their say, to have their opinions heard, and to be influential in some really powerful decision-making process. And we've explained that hopefully we will have that to them by the end of the year, and that closes the loop. So even though there is some kind of slipperiness in terms of it being a slightly novel approach to having to conduct focus group discussions in this way, and it being a delicate subject, we've been able to show to them the value of them being involved. So those are some reflections that we have had in very real time in learning how to adapt our focus group discussion approach with a sensitive topic, with a vulnerable population, and with limited connectivity. It is still possible. Thank you very much.